Okay, I don't think we're expecting any student audience.
No.
All right, so okay, since everybody is here, I know it's not, oh, it's time already anyway. So just to make sure that everybody can see his slides, can? Okay, so let's begin. Good morning, colleagues. Welcome to today's repeat PhD oral examination, where the candidate Ko Hon Chia will be presenting his PhD work entitled "A Study of Interest in Learning in a Maker-Centered Learning Environment." So, I'm Adrian, and I shall be the chair of this session. The other members, Prof. Chen Wenli, head of LSA, internal examiner, Prof. Tan Xing Chi, nominated oral panel member, Prof. Wang Qiyun. The supervisor is Prof. David Hung. The co-supervisor is Dr. Kenneth Lim. So as part of this exam, it has two objectives, right? First is to test the candidate's knowledge in the field, and then to determine that the candidate has indeed become an expert in his work. And then B is to satisfy the panel that the thesis is indeed the work of the candidate. So allow me to explain the process. The candidate will be given 30 to 40 minutes to present his work, and then the panel members will ask questions. Throughout this session, the supervisor will play a silent, supportive role, and then the chair reserves the right to ask questions and moderate the proceedings. When the panel is satisfied with the question and discussion, the candidate will leave this meeting, and then we will deliberate on the outcome of this examination, which is one of the following, right? Pay attention to this. There will be only 3 outcomes. A, pass the oral exam without further amendments to the thesis. B, pass the oral exam with some amendments to the thesis. So these 2 classifications are the cases of passing, right? Whether with amendments or no amendments. And then the third option and the final one is to fail the oral examination. That's the third option. So when a decision has been reached, the candidate will be invited back into the conversation, and then we will announce the results. So yes, please bear in mind that this is an exam, so do turn off your microphone if you're not speaking. However, if there is a breakdown in communication, you can't hear properly or whatever, please voice it out so that we can rectify it as soon as we can. Hon Chia, I pass the time to you.
Okay. Before I start, let me check the volume. Is it okay?
It's great.
Okay. First, I'd like to apologize first. I must admit I'm not good at communicating through the online screen, and I kind of rely a lot on the visual cues, eye contact, and social interactions when I communicate. So I'm sorry, I just realized my shortcomings recently. Okay, let me start with. So the title of my thesis and today's presentation is a study on interest in the learning in a maker-centered learning environment. This is an overview of the topics that will be covered in this presentation. I will take you through this study, starting with the research problems and ending with the discussions and implications arising from this study. Several studies have reported the decline of interest in learning, especially in STEM-related subjects. This is a serious concern in today's world, where we are at the tipping point of facing the calamities of climate change. On top of that, we are also facing the challenge of more frequent pandemics. We need innovations, not just in technology, but also in mindsets. And if our young are not interested in learning in STEM-related innovations, we are into serious problem. Nature has its resilience in fighting back, so do us. Take, for example, the emergence of makerspaces. Several studies have reported positive impacts on makerspace programs in increasing students' interest in learning and in STEM. What is it about makerspaces that seems to buck the trend? Is it in the way we understand the concept of interest? Is there something unique about the social and cultural context of a makerspace. This led us to the next logical problem. How have you been looking at the concept of interest? Fortunately, there have been studies that point us in the right direction. Several studies have argued for the need to expand the concept of interest from one that is individualistic to one that encompasses the social and cultural dimension, from one that focuses on the intra-mental dimension to one that encompasses the inter-mental dimension. This study aims to investigate the concept of interest in relation to the social and cultural construct, using makerspace as the context. To investigate the problems mentioned earlier, the main research questions of this study focuses on the relationship of two main areas, namely the student's interest in learning and the social context in a makerspace. And through the lens of activity theory, as it offers a robust framework and structure to investigate the social interactions and mediating agents within the community. Hence, the main research question, how do the social networks in a makerspace influence the interest in learning through the lens of activity theory? To investigate deeper, two sub-research questions were formulated. One aims to investigate students' preferred mode of learning in a makerspace. The other aims to investigate students' interest in STEM in a makerspace. Hence the question, how do the affordances of a makerspace support students' preferred mode of learning? And the question, how does a makerspace support students' interest in STEM-related activity? Literature reviews were conducted in relation to makerspaces, the concept of interest, and activity theory. Studies have shown that the learning outcomes of maker-centered learning usually prioritize character building and dispositions such as agency over disciplines, knowledge, or skills. In a study, it was reported that the youth in a makerspace usually find that they have a greater say in what and how to make. Several studies have reported that makerspace allows a person to develop interest in STEM. Numerous studies have been conducted to investigate the concept of interest. For example, interest is differentiated into short-term and long-term in the form of situational interest and individual interest. In a model explaining the development of interest called the four-phase model, the approach was to connect interest from the time of emergence, progressing to the time where it settled into a well-developed form in an individual. However, this concept of interest primarily revolved around interest as an individual construct. Several studies have argued for the need to reconceptualize interest. For example, instead of interest as an individualistic construct, interest is treated as a social mediated artifact. Hence, studies have argued for the need to consider the social, cultural context and interpersonal processes within which individual activities such as interest occurs. Activity theory allows a framework to study the social cultural context in which interest occurs. In this study, there are multiple activity systems in a makerspace, and the interactions between these activity systems were investigated. There are studies that have reported how cross-boundary interactions between activity systems offer a larger context towards fostering higher level of students' epistemic engagement. In another study, it was reported that boundary object formed between activity systems serve as a common object to bind together to bind them together. In a more recent study, it was reported that tensions emerge as new activity systems attempts to influence well-established activity systems towards a more active learning role. And these boundary activities systems were investigated through the lens of activity theory. Activity theory has its roots in bridging the intra-mental construct to the intermental construct. In the second generations of activity theory, the concept of community was considered. And this brings about a wider perspective of how community influence the objective outcome of an individual. In the third generation of activity theory, an even wider perspective and social context is considered. For example, it brings into attention multiple different communities interact and influence each other. This led to the emergence of at least two properties. One is the emergence of boundary objects between activity systems. The other is the emergence of boundary conditions of the activity systems, both of which are the objects of interest in these studies. The diagram illustrates activity system devised in this study. The subject of the activity is represented by the student. The community is represented by the classmates, project group members, and course facilitators. The immediate learning goals of the students are to build prototype, complete project work, and submit assignment. The activity system is supported through mediation by artifacts, rules, divisions of labors among the community. In this study, the affordances of a makerspace and the maker-centered pedagogical approach are considered as part of the mediating artifacts. There are altogether 18 participants in this study. 2/3 of them are males and 1/3 are females. They came from 3 cohorts of students and from 8 academic disciplines. Roughly half of them have at least a few years of experience in an IHL STEM-related discipline, which include their time in Polytechnic. The participants in these studies were all attending an elective module conducted in NIE, which has a focus on the Internet of Things. The elective module runs for about 3 months, with 8 to 8 face-to-face sessions, each session is about 3 hours. The same 3 course facilitators conducted the module for all the 18 participants. Same materials and hands-on activity kits were used. The hands-on activity kits include microbits and Lego Mindstorms. Their project works involve creating prototype or proof of concept. The classroom where the sessions were conducted was designed as a makerspace. The furniture was highly configurable. There were plenty of discussion space, including mediating artifacts like the TV screens. There were workbench with electronics tools and a corner for 3D scanning. There were past projects on display and plenty of electronics gadgets for use in the cabinets. In the makerspace and during the sessions, the students were free to tinker and make things. They were also free to mingle and interact with different people. The curriculum was designed so that they were free to choose the projects to work on and the group members to work with. During the hands-on activity sessions, they were free to decide the number of iterations of the prototype created. In this study, mixed method was adopted. This study is primarily qualitative, supported by quantitative data. This study uses single-phase design, where instruments used were implemented during the same time frame. The instruments used include survey, classroom observation, social network, focus group discussion, and semi-structured interview. Thematic analysis was used to address the research questions of this study. This is an overview of the methodology used in this study. It shows the development from data collections using various instruments to conducting thematic analysis and generating the codes from making sense of the data collected, to identifying the main themes that emerged, to finally relating to the research questions. We will visit this diagram again and again in subsequent parts of this presentation. So there were 4 main themes identified, namely mode of learning, social and physical support, autonomy of learners, and finally, social network in the makerspace. Next, I will be showing some examples of codes used in identifying the themes. Through the data collected from various instruments, meanings and contexts were extracted to generate the codes that are useful for thematic analysis. The codes were grouped to identify the themes that emerged. For example, the codes on the left of the table leads to the theme social network in the makerspace, and the theme relates to the main research question on the right, on how social networks in the makerspace influence interest in learning. In the interest of time, I will only give 1 or 2 examples of how the codes came about for each theme. For example, students were observed interacting among themselves in the sessions, and they talked and discussed with each other, especially during hands-on sessions. This was coded as social interactions. Another example, the students were observed to work in a group, and the frequency of the group activity increases. This was coded as group activities. This table shows the codes themes that relate to the research sub-questions on how the affordances of makerspace support students' preferred mode of learning. From the codes generated, 2 themes were identified, namely mode of learning and social and physical support. For example, the extract from the student, which highlighted the flexibility of the learning environment, was coded as flexible learning environment. The extract from the student, which described the support received from the teachers, was coded as support from teachers. These tables shows the codes and themes that relate to the sub-research questions on how does a makerspace support students' interest in STEM-related activity. From the codes generated, the theme that emerged was autonomy of learner. For example, the extract from the student, which highlighted the autonomy of the class, which helps to facilitate discussion and learning, was coded as autonomy in learning. In the following slides, I will go through the results, analysis, and discussion in relation to the research questions one by one. First, I will present the results and analysis in relation to the theme social network in the makerspace, followed by the discussion in relation to the research questions. This is a snapshot of some of the activities that were conducted during the sessions. Through these social and sometimes hands-on activities, the social networks that emerged were plotted and analyzed. This is an overview of the social networks representing 4 different sessions at the earlier part of the course. From For each social network, 3 values were computed. They are the average clustering coefficient, average path length, and network density. This is an overview of the social networks from another 4 sessions at the later part of the course. Looking at individual social network and values alone might not reveal much. Therefore, in this study, the values from all the social networks are plotted in a graph to reveal hidden patterns. The result of plotting the computed values against the progressions of the sessions reveal something, a global pattern. The orange graph represents the average path length in an upward trend. Similarly, the blue graph represents the average clustering coefficient in an upward trend. Whereas on the other hand, the gray graph represents the network density in a somewhat downward trend. From the results of the social network analysis, coupled with the context where the activities had taken place, the increasing trend for the average clustering coefficients and average path lengths correlates with the sessions becoming more student-centric, with more hands-on and group-based activities. One takeaway is that as the clustering among students groups increase, the ease of connections between the groups decrease. This is an indication of boundary formation among the activity systems, which regulates the connection between activity systems. In addition, the decreasing trend for the network density also coincides with the formations of group-based activities among the students. This led to a positive impact on the reduction of overall conformity across the activity systems and on the creativity among the students, as shown by the prototypes created by different groups of students. Let's take a look at what does it mean to the research question on how do the social networks in a makerspace influence interest in learning through the lens of activity theory. First, is a need to expand the embodiment of mediating artifacts in activity systems to include the ideologies and dispositions that both the individual and community brought with, in order to better account for the influence of social context in mediating the activity systems in a makerspace. Second, is the usefulness in considering the boundary conditions of an activity system in mediating and regulating the interactions and relationships between activity systems. This would also help in dealing with the object that emerge beyond the boundary. With the expansion of the embodiment of the mediating artifacts and the considerations of the boundary conditions, it affords a structure to fill the gap between the boundary objects and the activity systems. One of these intra-boundary elements that emerge as a result of the ideologies and dispositions of an individual and community is what I call system-level interest, which is a social construct. It is influenced by both the boundary objects and the activity systems, and it also serves as a conduit between the two. When we put them together in a multi-activity systems, the adapted chat provides an expanded framework in studying cross-boundary interactions between activity systems. It allows a richer structure, such as different layers of boundary conditions and intra-boundary elements that mediates interactions, such as system-level interest. Next, in the following slides, I'll go through the results, analysis, and discussion in relation to the sub-questions sub-research questions. First, I'll present the result analysis in relation to the theme mode of learning and social and physical support, followed by the discussion in relation to the research question. This table shows the results of survey related to the theme mode of learning. These are the results plotted as charts, and we'll look at the charts in more detail. From this chart, the most preferred mode of learning was lecture, followed by team hands-on, individual hands-on, and lastly, self-study. From this chart, the most preferred resource of learning was lecture, which supported the result from the previous chart. It was an interesting and puzzling thing that the students had indicated very positive experiences and feedbacks toward Makerspace. So what else could support or explain this dichotomy? So let's look at the results from the extracts of the students. It provided another perspective. This perspective shed light on the theme, social and physical support. The recurring message from this theme is that the social and physical support found in a Makerspace had sparked their interest in learning. And this interest in learning transcended across different modes of learning. Therefore, the social and physical support in a Makerspace could support other modes of learning, both structured and unstructured types. Let's look at what does it mean to the sub-research question on how do the affordances in a Makerspace support students' preferred mode of learning? Firstly, Makerspace had a positive impact on students' preferred mode of learning, even if it is not maker-centered learning. Secondly, Makerspace can coexist with other modes of learning. Thirdly, Makerspace can be mutually supportive with other modes of learning, and other modes of learning can support Makerspace too. Next, in the following slides, I will go through the results, analysis, and discussion in relation to the remaining sub-research questions. The extracts from the students strongly suggested the positive impact of having autonomy in learning, especially towards their interest in STEM-related activities. For example, for students who from having lost interest in STEM previously to wanting to apply IoT to his daily life, such as in sailing, windsurfing, and making his auto-closing curtain. Although having the autonomy in learning was welcomed by most of the students, some of them had also found that it could be a challenge. The challenge was not just in how an individual managed his or her own autonomy, but also in how the community share and manage the distributed autonomy. Let's look at what does it mean to the sub-research question on how does a Makerspace support students' interest in STEM-related activity? From the findings, the Makerspace had a positive impact in cultivating and sustaining students' interest in STEM-related activity. One of the key contributing factors that recurred throughout was that the students make connections of the STEM-related activity to their lives, be it to their academic pursuits, future careers, or personal interests. Another contributing factor is the transformation of interest from the individual dimension to a larger social dimension, which I call collective interest or system-level interest. Another interesting findings from this study is that unfamiliar environment, when coupled with autonomy, in a makerspace could lead to an increase in a sense of maker agency and creative confidence. One important aspect that arises from previous findings and discussions is the concept of shared autonomy. A social and culturally rich context, such as a makerspace, allow an individual's interest to grow together with a sense of autonomy, but mediated by their social environment, which led to the transformation of intramental construct to intermental construct in the form of shared interests. And ultimately, for the community to share a common interest, there's a need to have a sense of shared autonomy. However, shared autonomy does not remain static or isolated, and constantly evolved with the system. And shared autonomy requires diversity, negotiation, and sharing of a common object. In a teaching and learning environment, tension exists between the level of autonomy and between the level of autonomy of the learners and the level of intervention by the teachers. From this study, the implication to the conceptualization of interest is that there's a need to expand the concept of interest to include the social context and influence. The implications to the use of activity theory are that it is useful to expand the structure of boundary crossing activity systems and boundary objects to include boundary conditions. And it is also useful to expand the embodiment of mediating artifacts to include social elements, such as ideologies and dispositions. Finally, the implications to the education practice are that it is beneficial to integrate makerspace into the classroom to support various established teaching and learning approaches. To foster interest in STEM learning, both depth and breadth are needed. Breadth to allow a wider range of choices, and depth to allow deeper and more meaningful pursuit. However, there are also challenges in makerspace. For example, for students who need more guidance or are not motivated, they would need the active intervention by the teachers. Lastly, social support has been found to be beneficial to makerspace, and I believe it can be translated to be beneficial to remote and online learning, which has become a very important part of our education system today. Thank you, and I'd like to thank my PhD supervisors, Prof. Hang and Dr. Kenneth, and I'd like to thank the panel members, Prof. Tan and Prof. Wang, and Prof. Chen and Prof. Key.